Hello and welcome back to 123 Java. This video is going to be about operators. I figured I would make this video because on the last video we touched on conditionals, if statements, else, and else-ifs, and operators are going to be really crucial when you're writing all these statements, so you need to know what these different kinds of these signs mean, especially when you're writing conditionals. So let's get started. So there are a few different types of operators that you're going to see. There's actually a few more, but I'm not going to cover them in this video because I definitely don't think you would use them right away. So we have these arithmetic ones, which should be the most straightforward to learn because they do serve very similar functionalities to what you will see like in math. So this is a plus, addition, pretty simple. It's a minus for subtraction. This star is for multiplication. This slash here is for division. And then this is the modulo operator. You may not have seen that yet, but essentially what modulo does is it will divide a number and then spit out its remainder. So modulo comes in really handy when you want to check to see if a particular number is a multiple of another number. So if you were to write this in an if statement, you could do something like, if some number modulo, say we want to check all even numbers. Well, all even numbers are divisible by 2, right? So if number modulo 2 equals 0, this 0 here is the remainder. So like I said, modulo divides the number and then spits out the remainder. So if something is divisible by something, it will have a remainder of 0. So if number modulo 2 equals 0, that means the number is even. And then you can have something happen in this block here. And that can be done for anything, any number. So say you only want to deal with multiples of 5, you could do something like that. And same thing. Okay, so that's modulo. And then we have plus and minus. I've touched on this in the previous videos, but here's a more explicit explanation. It's very simple. This is just, with plus, you're just incrementing by 1, and with minus, you're just decrementing by 1. So if you have an integer I at 0, you could write I equals I plus 1. That'll make give I plus 1. You could write I equals I minus 1, which will decrement it by 1. Or you could just write out this, I plus, and that will literally do the exact same thing. I plus, this is the exact same as this. It's just a different way to write syntax, often like easier, simpler, more clean, just like better style. So this is doing the exact same thing. You're just adding 1 to whatever number. Here you're subtracting 1 from whatever number. And that'll get to be really handy, especially in loops and such, when you always want to add or decrement by 1. So that's those. And then we have these relational operators, which we've kind of touched on, but again, I wanted to explain more. So let's start from this end. You have this greater than and smaller than, these two. And you can also change this to be, if you want to do greater than or equals or smaller than or equals, you can just change it to that, and that'll work. So those are pretty straightforward. Same as in math. You can, again, put that in an if statement, if some number is greater than 0, blah, 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 something like that. And then we have this double equals, and this is not equals here. Now, the distinction between double equals and single equals might be a little confusing for now. It has to do with reference equalities, and those are kind of more complicated, but we'll get to that later. But for now, just know that, so we talked about if you have some variable I and you set it to 0, this is a single equals here. This single equals does not serve the same functionality that it would in mathematics, for instance. This isn't saying I is always equal to 0, I is 0, pure and simple. Like, this equals here is actually very tentative, because remember, we're thinking of variables as we're thinking of boxes, where a variable is a box. So I've created this box called I, and I put 0 into this box, and that's what this equals means. However, this can always change. We can always switch out 0. We can take 0 out from the box and put another number into it. So then I can go I equals 1. Now this might look weird at first because it's like there are two equalities for the same thing. How can one thing be equal to two things? Well, that's the distinction between this equals and the difference, how it differs from equals in math, for instance. Equals in computer science is mutable, it's tentative, which means that this is it's temporary. You can always change it. So this is not a definite equals. You can always mutate this to change to another value. So that's the single equals. We've gone over that. But then you'll see this double equals. So if you want to get really into it, double equals has to do with our two things pointing to the same location in the heap. And you probably don't know what that means right now, but just know that contrary to the single equals, this double equals is a pure true equality statement because it refers to where something is in memory. That might be a little complicated, but the reason why we need to talk about this now is because when you're writing if statements, inside of an if parentheses goes a boolean. And you could never write something like if I equals 1 inside of this because this is not a true Boolean statement. Oftentimes, I think you might get a compiler error if you try to do something like this because it's not checking for a true equality, so it can't be a true Boolean. So when you are trying to check something in an if block and you want to see, like if you want to check that a certain number is equal to 2, you would need to write it like this for that to work. Because again, this is a little more complicated, but just when you're starting out, just know that double equals is necessary when you're writing these if blocks because you are checking for true equality. So we have this double equals, and now you see this exclamation point and equals. That just means not equals. So say you want to, this will come in handy a lot. Say you want to do something to every single number that isn't 0, or any number, but let's say it's 0 for now. Because, I don't know, maybe you want to make sure you're not dividing by 0 or something like that. And so you want to avoid one specific value. You can just check not equals to. So if a number I is not equal to 0, then do something. And this something will be applied to every single number that isn't 0. And so that's just a convenient way because you wouldn't want to do like the flip side. You wouldn't have to write out and deal with every single number that isn't 0 because that's just a pain and doesn't really make sense. So you can just use this not equals to have some statement here or some code here applied to everything that's not this. So there's that. So those should be, you're definitely going to start seeing those really early on in conditionals. Then we have these logical operators. So I'll just go ahead and explain what these are in English because you'll find that when you're writing code, you can just, at least when you're starting out, kind of like if you're trying to break up different conditionals, you can say, you can kind of go through it in your head and you'll realize that you're probably using and or not, and that's what these mean. So I'll go ahead and explain. So this means and. These two pipes here mean or, and this exclamation just means not. So I think the best way to just explain it is to go ahead and show you. So say you want to write an if something, but you want to check for two things in one statement here. So say you have an integer I that is equal to 0. Then you say you have another integer j is equal to 1. And maybe somewhere in your code you're incrementing these or changing their values or whatever. But say you want to do something to something when I and j are both equal to, when I is equal to 1, and also when j is equal to 1. So that's when and comes in. And like I said, it does help out to kind of say something in English, because it turns out that when you try and write this, you're going to be using the exact same, these operators that kind of match up with what you're saying in your head. So let's say, so then we want to, again, so we want to have something happen when I is equal to 0 and j is equal to 1. So if I equals 1, and, that's where the and comes in, j equals 1, then do something. So see how that works? So that's an easy way to check for 2 conditions. You can check for more than 2, actually. But so that's where the and comes in. Straightforward, because it's just like and in English. Another way you could actually do this is you could nest this if. So here's an if block, and you could actually write another if block in here, if j equals 1. And the way this will operate just the same way it has with our, like we wrote it with the and. It'll go through and it'll say, it'll check, is I equal to 0? Yes, it is. So then it'll go inside. And then it'll check again, is j equal to 1? Yes, it is. And that's when it'll reach, this code here. So yeah, that's another way to write it. If you're only dealing with like 2, I would just recommend using the and. It's easier to read and you'll probably understand it more. So then we have or, which is similar. Again, it'll help to understand just by speaking English. So say you want to do something when just not both of the conditions have to be true. So like when we wrote this, when we wrote this by using the and, both of these have to be true. I has to be equal to 0 and j has to be equal to 1 for whatever code to happen here. But say it doesn't really matter, not both of them have to be equal. Say you want to check that just 1 is true. That's where or comes in. So now let's say I change this to 0, j is 0. So now you have this or. So you're checking, is I equal to 0? Yes, it is. Is j equal to 1? No, it's not. This is true and this is false. But because you've written or, it doesn't matter because only one of them has to be true. So this will still happen. What will happen here? Because you used or and only one of them has to be true. But if you used and, you want to check that I equals 0. Yes, it is. And you want to check that j equals 1. Is that true? No, it's false. So because you use and, the code will not happen. So I've kind of written out all the different scenarios in this way here. So if you have 2 conditions that are true, so I equals 0 and j equals 0. Are they both true? True, true? Yes, they are, because they're both equal to 0. So when they're both true, and will be true, and this code will happen. Okay. And if we switch this to or, it'll still happen. The code will still happen because the only one of them has to be true, and it just happens that both of them are true. So it will still work. It'll just check that one of them is true, and 2 of them are true, so that's even better, and the or will also still happen. Now, let's say we have the first one is true, and the second one is false. So I equals 0, j equals 1. So like we said, if we were to use and would be false, and this code will not happen. Because it needs to have both of these be true. I is equal to 0 is true. J is equal to 1 is false. Because you're using and, you want to check both of them. One of them is not true, so it can't execute this. But if you used or here, it will happen because it just wants to check that one of them is true. And this 0, I equals 0 here, is true. So it looks kind of the same for something that's just the opposite. The first one's false and the second one's true. The and will be false, but the or will be true. Now if both of them are false, so let's say if I equals 5 and j equals 7. Is I equal to 5? Nope. Is j equal to 7? Nope. They're both false. So if you try to use this and, code will not happen, because this whole whatever's in brackets will just not be executed. And then if we use the or, well, what's going to happen? Same thing. Nothing's going to happen, because for or to happen, at least one of them has to be true. This is false because it's 0. This is false because it's 0. So that won't happen if the two values you're dealing with are false. So this is kind of a handy, you might want to draw this out in a chart of some sort. You know, you can have any values, say I is A and J is B, any two values that are true, both the and the or will be true. If it's a mixed condition where one is true and one is false, the and will always be false because it needs both of them to be true, and the or will still be true though because one of them is true. But then if they're both false, both the and the or will be false because there's not a single true condition in there. So again, this is at least for me, I've sometimes I'll draw this out as a chart, and it'll help because it's just a quick way to see what you're doing. So there's a brief introduction to operators, arithmetic, relational, logical, and just be sure to think about those when you're building your if statements. If you have multiple conditions or whatever it might be, there's an infinite possible amount of combinations for what you might want to do. So thank you for watching, and hope this helped. Thank you.